this is a good time to let you know that this session is being recorded. So if you have any concerns about that, I would suggest, just leave your camera off. But the reason that we are recording the session is that all of the dialogues are posted to NICWA's YouTube channel, and that's just so that folks can tune in and learn if they're not able to make it to the actual live event. So returning back to my previous train of thought, this is dialogue series number 7. We are thrilled to have actually 4 wonderful speakers today. Jocelyn Formsma, and I'll introduce the speakers more fully as we come to their presentations, Dr. Priscilla Day. And we have a video of 2 guests joining us from Australia. They are not here live, obviously, because it is either the middle of the night or very early in the morning down there, but they very graciously stepped in and sent us a video that we'll be sharing as our third panel presentation this morning. Betty, if you want to move ahead to the second slide. So housekeeping items, I just want to go through this really quick. As Betty mentioned, if you have any questions about using the Zoom technology, I think that we're all more proficient at it than we were when we started session number 1. But if you do have any questions, please just pop them in the chat. We have folks from both the Caring Society and NICWA moderating. We'll be using the chat as well to pop in links so that if there's something that you hear about in the speaker presentation, you can check the chat, and oftentimes we'll pop that URL right in there so that you can save it. As well, by registering for the session, you will get an email afterwards with this PowerPoint deck. And if the presenters have consented to share their presentations, we will send that to you as well, along with the link to the YouTube channel so that you can catch up on the past sessions if you haven't been able to join. This is, as I said, the 7th and final dialogue series presentation. We were just talking before we opened up the room, and we were saying, oh, it already feels nostalgic. We can't believe we're at number 7 already. When we started this and we were thinking about planning ahead to November, that sounded impossible because, this started at the beginning of the year, but here we are. Touchstones of Hope, for those of you who haven't been tuning in for the full session and maybe not familiar with the background, it was created way back 2005 at a gathering of Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders in child welfare on the territory of the 6 Nations of the Grand River, also known as Niagara Falls. They came together to talk about what was needed for reconciliation and child welfare to happen in an ethical way, in a meaningful way. So these experts came together and they developed a process of 4 phases, non-linear. So, these phases would meld together, as well as touchstones, as we came to call them, principles for guiding that process of reconciliation. Today, we're talking about structural interventions, but we have had sessions on culture and language, non-discrimination, self-determination, and holistic approach, and all of those are on the YouTube channel. For this session, we have, as I mentioned, our 3 presenters. They're going to speak for about 20 minutes each, and then we will have our questions at the end. So if you do have questions, you can put them in, and you don't want to forget, you can put them in the chat at any time, and myself or some of our other moderators will make sure that they are set aside to be asked at the end. And you can also follow up with us by email. As I said, you'll be getting an email with all of this information after the session. Lastly, just to reiterate the importance of Touchstones of Hope, it's been 16 years now since this philosophy, we call it a philosophy, not a program, not an initiative. It's a philosophy for guiding, ethical reconciliation based on principles that elders and family members, they've been talking about for generations. It's been 16 years since this philosophy was developed, and it continues to have such deep resonance today for not just people working in regards to child welfare, child well-being, but we've seen people take up this process and principles in other contexts, workplace environments, education. We've used it at the Caring Society to structure our strategic policy, thinking about, okay, how do we go about serving the people that we're meant to serve in an ethical way? So the implications are vast. And again, I think it's because these people who came together, and we're very fortunate that both Dr. Day and Jocelyn were there at that original gathering in 2005, as well as Terry Cross, who is a founding member of NICWA, and I believe is on our session as well, perhaps hiding there in the background. But these people came together with immense knowledge, and they shared it so graciously and with such integrity. And I think that's why it holds true today. And so with that, I would really be honored to pass the floor to Dr. Priscilla Day, who is an enrolled tribal member of the Leech Lake Reservation. She's also a professor of social work, retired, but a national consultant who continues to do wonderful work on the US side of the fake border. So with that, welcome, Dr. Day, and thank you.
Thank you. Buju and Dinaway Magani Dug. Gije Baben Bene Sequin Kaz Makwan and Dudem, Gazgasqua, Jimmy Cognin Dunjiba. So, hello, my relatives. I'm happy to join you here today for this really important conversation. My spirit name is Thunderbird Circling in the Sky Woman, and that really defines a lot of my work that I've gone to many places and worked with a variety of tribes and other groups. I'm from the Bear Clan. I am an enrolled member of the Leech Lake Reservation, and if you look at this little collage I put together, Leech Lake is the larger pink area. That's our tribal boundaries, our contemporary tribal boundaries. I'm a mother of 3 and grandmother of 10, which is really a fun time in my life. As Jennifer said, I've retired from the University of Minnesota Duluth, and that's on the very far right corner. I spent almost 30 years there teaching social work and directing the Center for Regional and Tribal Child Welfare Studies. I live now on my actual ancestral homes, and that's the bottom right corner is a picture of the lake off of my great-grandma's original allotment. And Leech Lake was known as the last battle between the United States and tribal nations at the end of the 1800s. The picture in the middle is the boarding school that my grandmother attended when she was 4. And all of these things together are part of who I am today. All these places and people and events really shape who I am. And I think in order to have really meaningful truth and reconciliation, they really, we need to be able to share those things, to know them, know our own family and community's history, and to be able to share those with one another. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this slide other than these are some really important elements of reconciliation and of that truth part, and as well as ideas for the reconciliation part. And we each have a responsibility in that. Sorry, I forgot to turn on my timer. There we go. Next slide, please. I think to understand that we all have a role, and to really explore what that means for us as individuals, what it means for our organizations, what it means for our communities and our engagement with one another. And it's a lifetime process. I'm still learning more about my family and my tribe, and our history, and certainly things that are currently happening um, in Indigenous lands. I think for non-Native people, it's really needing to also engage in a similar process, to really be able to truly listen and to really believe that Indigenous people in particular um, are can help lead the way into a shared future. And we need to really always come with intent and an openness, and that's much easier said than done. Um, and to really recognize, and this is a structural piece, that individual efforts alone are not going to change the way our systems are structured. Um, and so we really need to be able to think deeply about law, policy, practice, and have that kind of structural lens when we're looking at so-called problems and solutions, because then we can come together and co-create structural interventions. Um, and it has to be with those who are most impacted. Next slide, please. This slide is really, I'm not going to talk a huge amount about this, but this is actually some work I started with NICWE, comes from work I started with NICWE, I want to say like in 1997, when NICWE partnered with, NICWA partnered with Casey Family Programs to publish a series of um, articles and documents to really try to put material out there about Indigenous ways of being. And in that those booklets we put together, I worked with Dr. Redhorse and a few other folks, and we call these mediating structures, which of course is kind of an academic word. And so recently, in some work that I was involved with a capacity building center for tribes, which is a federally funded program that is to really support tribal practices in child welfare. We developed this document, which these are not new things. These are things that we have always engaged with, ways of being, but I really love this visual because it centers the child and it shows our natural supportive and helping and healing structures in our communities. And so it encourages tribal programs then to really restore and re-engage with these protective systems of care that are intergenerational, but also very forward-looking. And so in the States anyway, we have tribal sovereignty and our tribal nations that really are the outside protective circle. And then within that are our tribal structures. And then in the center is really our extended families, our cultural ways, our languages, our music, all of those things that have always been in our communities. And they all help to raise our children in a way that they're healthy and they're connected to their culture. And these are the models for restorative practice. And we want others to recognize these as valid and to support us in being able to practice in this way. And that's all kinds of structural stuff, that all of the tribal systems and programs Those are all structural interventions that can be framed with this intergenerational model. So what are the barriers? And one of the things I've been really thinking about recently is how does our trauma, which we all have, we're not all aware of it, but we all have it, and how does that impact our ability to engage effectively in deep conversations about structural changes? And we all have work to do. So I, a few years ago, he's actually African-American therapist from Minnesota, wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. And it's racialized trauma and the pathway to mending our bodies, our hearts and our bodies. And he does a very good job of having us think about and be aware of the trauma we each bring to the table. And this has real life applications. I am at almost weekly meetings, cross-cultural meetings, where we're really trying to engage and think about practicing in different ways. And so often people get traumatized, get triggered and go into a trauma response. And myself included, I've really been trying to pay attention to what sets me off. And then we need to recognize those things and then be able to have a community that we can have conversations with. And of course I have, a lot of Indigenous folks I can have conversations with, but I'm also fortunate to have colleagues that have done their own work around, white colleagues who've done their own work, and really be able, oh, I'm sorry, can you put the next slide up? Sorry. I'm talking about this next slide. And it has My Grandmother's Hands on there. And so I can reach out, and I had I reached out to a friend who's a dean actually at a school of social work here in Minnesota, and just said, I'm kind of stuck because what do I do when I bring something up and people freeze? And it was very helpful to have someone just to walk through that from her perspective. And those are the kind of really deep conversations we need to have. And she talks about white supremacy and how embedded that is in the way people think, in the way, of course, the way our systems are structured and in our laws and policies. And we have to be able to talk with each other about that, to recognize that, and then to come together to co-create different ways of being together. And again, that's something that's, much easier to say and much harder to do. Next slide, please. So I was at as Jennifer said, I was at that 2005 gathering in Niagara Falls, and that was a huge learning for me, because even though I had been doing cross-cultural work and training for a number of years, I got triggered pretty early on in that process. And my response at the time was flight. And I was there actually with Dr. John Redhorse, and he got triggered too. And so it's very hard when two of you are triggered at the same time to talk yourselves down. And I think other Native people did too, and chose a different path. And they engaged in some healing. work that was being done, but I got stuck. And how, the question is, how do we, first of all, we have to recognize, and then how do we calm ourselves down? Because when we have a trauma response, our brain actually goes into lower level thinking, and we're really we can't engage with that problem solving part of our brain. And this is an ongoing barrier to have these cross-cultural conversations, which are an integral part of truth as well as reconciliation. And how do people with privilege, it's not that privilege in itself is bad, it's what you do with it. And I used to tell my students all the time, how are you going to share that? How are you going to create pathways for other people who don't have that privilege? And so my colleague, who's a dean, she's mentoring people, white people, to really look at their unearned privilege and look at ways to create those pathways. So she talked about working with a woman on the East Coast who has a business, and talking with her about ways that she might support African-American business that's just getting up and going. And so she's very intentionally looking at not just giving her insider tips and that kind of thing, but really helping to, talking to systems, talking to the insurance company to say, the way you set this up is not equitable. So she's an ally taking action to change systems that she sees advantage her and disadvantage this African-American business. And those are the kind of things that I think we need to be able to get to. And you have to have community to have those conversations. And you have to be able to talk through with people when you're struggling and unsure what to do. And lots of times the organizations really want to do something, so I was in a recent conversation about microaggressions, and they wanted to develop a protocol. And the protocol was basically to have the person who had been injured remind the white person that they had done something. And I'm like, that you're putting the responsibility on the injured party when you do those kind of things. And so we need to be able to develop ways that the people who are most privileged can have conversations with each other to create systemic change. Next slide, please. So I like this diagram because it really shows that progression from where most of our systems are, which are trauma reactive and trauma inducing, certainly our child welfare systems. And they're very siloed and kind of fear-based. And they don't result in good outcomes, especially for Indigenous families. In the last probably 10 years or so, there's been a lot of talk about the middle column here, which is trauma informed, and that's certainly movement in the right direction. And so that's developing a deep understanding of trauma and to recognize the impact that that has, including things that our systems are doing that are traumatic for children and families. And then on the right side column, that is the development of trauma reducing organizations and structures that really not just reduce trauma, but have a healing environment. And you can see that these are a lot of the things that Indigenous people talk about looking at things holistically and being collaborative and collective, being relationship based, and really thinking about inclusion and equity, and thinking about that across the lifespan. And I think tribes are very good at understanding the important role of elders that our public systems don't do. And so I think it's really a nice model to look at. Next slide, please. So this slide is something that I'm kind of borrowing from a colleague in Florida, an African-American woman. And Florida is really trying to re-envision their child welfare system. And she brings up this concept of we need to not just evolve, because that's kind of incremental and tinkering around the edges. We really need to think about revolutionary structural change. And that is really change that's profound. It's change that's fundamental, and it's change that's transformational. And it's change that makes people uncomfortable because they're not used to doing it that way. It's change that really changes the status quo, so that it really is equitable and healing for people who experience it. And I would also say for the workforce, there's so many folks in child welfare that experience secondary trauma, and not just because of their high workloads and the kind of information they're hearing, but the way their systems are structured that don't respect them either. And so I think that's the goal, is that revolutionary structural change. Next slide, please. So what Florida and I think other folks are really trying to do is reimagining our current systems, and having them be more family-centered, anti-racist, inclusive, to stop doing some things like mandatory reporting, and termination of parental rights, neglect diversion out of child welfare to resources that can really support and help families stay together, and a co-creation process with those who are most impacted. Next slide. So there are a number of efforts that are beginning to happen and bubble up, that include laws and policies, creative partnerships, variety of practices, safety networks, changes in the court systems, and cultural restoration. And these are things that are actively starting, and they really need to be kind of scaled up. So there is a movement in the United States to upend child welfare. There's an organization out of the University of Houston that talks about that and provides education about that, and looking at either repealing or changing laws that structurally disrupt our families, or adding resources to things, to laws that don't have resources embedded. Peacemaking courts is something that Indigenous communities are taking the lead on to make court systems less adversarial. And then restorative cultural practices. There's a couple tribes here in Minnesota that are working very hard on embedding the grandfather teachings in their programming, and the ways in which they work with one another, and the ways in which they work with the community. All right, last slide, please. One of the organizations that I've been getting to know is called HIR Wellness. It's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it's an indigenous, healing indigenous roots. And it has a philosophy of community activated medicine. And it's such a beautiful concept. But one of the things they have done structurally is whenever they make an important decision, they have a ceremony. They do a sacred children's fire, and they use that as a way of getting a variety of input, again, across generations and from different perspectives. And it's centered on this quote about no law or no action shall be made that harms the children. And they question, what kind of culture would not put their children at the center of decision making? And I think that is a good mantra for all of us to have, is to remember that we need those protective systems, and we need to restructure our systems in ways that center children and families. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Day. That was beautiful, really. I think that what you spoke to helps us break apart one of the narratives that we hear up on the Canadian side anyways, in that, the problems are so big and there are no solutions, right? And so we just got to keep going with, as you said, that incremental change, because that's all we know how to do. When in fact, there are many people, many organizations, many nations that already have the solutions and are ready to implement them. And that's what we're talking about with structural intervention and reconciliation. We didn't get into this in this Touchstone series, but because Dr. Day introduced these ideas to us so beautifully, I wanted to just let the group know what the 4 phases of reconciliation are that were brought forward at the Touchstones gathering: truth-telling, acknowledging, relating, and restoring. So, talking about what happened, acknowledging what happened and what continues to happen, relating in a different way, and then working to restore what has been taken. And to me, I saw that in Dr. Day's discussion of healing organizations, right? Restoring the way things could have been if it didn't have this colonial history. But with that, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to turn it over now to Jocelyn. Jocelyn will introduce herself more fully, I'm sure, but she is a member of the Moose Cree First Nation, executive director of the National Association of Friendship Centers, a participant of the 2005 gathering, and also a former staff at the Caring Society, which is where I currently work. So she brings a lot to the table. Oh, also a NICWA board member. So she wears many hats, wears them beautifully, and we're very happy to have her today. Jocelyn, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thanks for switching spots with me and filling in so I could talk a little bit about some structural interventions today. Welcome, everyone. As mentioned, I'm from Moose Cree First Nation and currently the executive director of the National Association of Friendship Centers. We have over 100 member sites in every region in Canada that offer Indigenous-led, community-driven services to Indigenous peoples living in urban settings all across Canada. And we have at least, I wouldn't say like a strong relationship, but definitely a mutual respect for some of the work that some of the urban Indian centers are doing in the US and Seattle and Denver and all across the US. So thank you. As mentioned, I was invited to be a part of that gathering. Back then I was a youth representative, and it was the beginning of my journey with NICWA. And what I brought to the table, I thought, well, I'm not an expert in child welfare. I'm barely still in university, right? Like, what do I have to contribute to this conversation? But I had folks like Terry Cross and Sydney Blackstock say that you are an expert in your own experience, that you bring the voices of Indigenous young people to this conversation. And at that time, I had started to do some work in Indigenous children's rights. So I was familiar with things like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and just knew a lot and tried to do a lot in youth advocacy and youth engagement. And what did that look like in a meaningful way? What did that look like when we put not just the best interests for the child into our work, but actually the best interests of the child as expressed by children and young people themselves, right? So yeah, like Jennifer had just mentioned, this idea of the touchstones, it's a process guided by principles, right? And just beautifully went through those processes, which are truth telling. So talking to each other and having an open and honest exchange, right? Acknowledging, so affirming and understanding and learning from the past. Restoring, so actually like addressing the problems of the past and embracing those new possibilities. And relating is, how do we move forward in a good way, in a more respectful way, right? I think that's really important for me to share with folks that similar to way we talk about cultural competency, like you can't just take a workshop and then boom, you're culturally competent, right? Like you're constantly in a flux, you're constantly along a spectrum of understanding, and every new community that you engage with, you have to start that process over again, and you're going to be at different places. And I feel like it's the same with this idea of the touchstones and reconciliation, is that you're constantly engaging in new conversations based on that process and where you are at in the process. And some conversations will require the truth telling. Some conversations will be further along, and you're actually talking about restoring and what does restitution look like, and you're more advanced, and then maybe you work with another community. You have to start on a different part of that. And this conversation has gone through the principles, right? So self-determination, how do we ensure that Indigenous peoples are not just a part of the process, but are actually leading it, making the decisions, that are being appropriately compensated for their work, and their expertise is being recognized in everything that we're doing. That it's rooted in culture and language, that we're looking at the holistic approach, non-discrimination. The whole series has been these amazing examples, real life examples of what does this look like. And at the end of the day, in my opinion anyway, the conversations are never going to be enough as they are. At some point, you have to change the system. The system has to change. And that's, to me, what we're talking about with structural interventions, right? We can have the conversations, we can be following these principles, but if we do not actually intervene in the structures that are causing the harm, then what are we actually doing, right? Like we can walk away, say that was a really good conversation. 20 years later, we're still in the same situation that we are today and that we were 20 years ago, right? Because when we look at the data around child welfare, I think it's probably similar in the United States, but in Canada, the numbers of Indigenous children in child welfare system have not reduced, because we have not intervened structurally enough to ensure that we actually are reducing the number of children going into care, right? And then some regions across Canada, the number of Indigenous children proportional to their makeup in the population, like around 4 or 5%, but yet are closer to 50, 60, 70% of the children in the child welfare system. Like that means to me, that's not a broken community, that's not just a broken peoples, like that's a broken system that's targeting us. And so I want to talk today about one area that I've seen and I've been a part of structural interventions, and maybe some of those pros and cons, which is the United Nations system. We talk about international, right? Like I think a lot of the real work happens on the ground. It happens in community. It happens at a very hyper local level. But there have been examples of when we need to take the issues to a broader level, right? And I think NICWA is a wonderful advocate at the federal level with the federal government in the United States. They've been super active in unlocking funding and resources for tribes and for communities. They've been great at providing critical input into legislation, into the regulation, which I'll talk a little bit about on ICWA and other federal law. So we kind of need some of those national voices, and at times we need to go to the international level. So I think it's important that we talk about, you know, going back to self-determination, that our advocacy needs to be rooted in our own sovereignty. It starts in our bodies, it starts with our families, our communities, our nations, and Indigenous peoples across the world, right? That we have rights that aren't just, they haven't been created, they exist by virtue of us being born. And that we do have mechanisms that are legally binding that we can lean on to force states, when I say states, not just the United States, but nation states across the world, to comply with what they said they were going to do, right? That we cannot separate our rights from each other. So we have rights as Indigenous peoples. If we're women, we have rights as women. If we're children, we have rights as children, and that those rights mutually depend on one another and mutually reinforce each other. We cannot separate the child from our indigeneity. I cannot separate my identity as a woman from my identity as an Indigenous person, because when I was born, those things fused, and my experience in this world is really painted by my identity, right? Our rights, like, nobody can take those away from us. It's just whether or not our rights are being upheld or not. So I want to talk a little bit about what international mechanisms exist. And then I want to talk specifically on an international mechanism that I engaged with on behalf of the NICWA, along with Terry Cross, and sort of like the pros and cons of that process and what we were able to get out of it, right? As sort of a case study a little bit. So at the international level, there are a number of international mechanisms. Most of them that I'm aware of have to do with the United Nations. They're affiliated with the United Nations in some way. So there's an annual event called the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It takes place in New York City every year. And it's the place for kind of like a general convening of Indigenous mechanisms. They're thematic every year. They take on different aspects of issues that matter and are affecting Indigenous peoples around the globe. We have a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples whose job it is to, they have like an intake process, but then they also commission studies on Indigenous peoples around the world. There's the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people. They meet annually in Geneva, and they take on very specific studies. And there are other committees and mechanisms that are not specific to Indigenous, but have a big Indigenous component. For example, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the elimination of all forms of violence against women. There's probably a few more that I'm missing. And then there's also the Universal Periodic Review, in which member nation states of the United Nations go and just talk about how well are they doing or not with respect to upholding human rights within their geography, I guess, so to speak. Recently, I guess not so recently now, but we've had the passing of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a declaration, so that means there's no reporting mechanism, so the United States doesn't have to report, Canada doesn't have to report, but they incorporate how they've been implementing it throughout their reports on these other mechanisms. Some folks turn to the international system as a way to, I guess, try to seek some relief that they're not getting domestically. I have been very critical about using the international mechanisms as a remedy, because I actually, in my opinion, don't believe that they are always the most effective route to go. Yes, it's really cool to be in New York City. It's really cool to be in Geneva. It's really cool to be at the United Nations and meet Indigenous peoples from around the world and see how similar we are, talk about the differences and the nuances in the work that we're doing. But when we look at sort of our histories and what has garnered the most traction in making systemic change and structural change, it has not been the United Nations or international mechanisms that have really been that mechanism. It's really been the on the ground work that has had the greatest impact. That being said, it is and can be a useful tool if you're using it properly. And so the example that I wanted to share with you today was when we worked with a small team at NICWA to provide a report and go actually to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So for short, I'm going to call it the CERD. And this had to do, this is a reporting mechanism that all of the states that have signed on to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The United States was up and it was their turn to report on how well they've been doing. And then you get, they're called civil society organizations, to provide shadow reports. So the US wrote its report, and then all of these organizations wrote their shadow report saying, well, yes, but, or yes, and, or no, that's not true at all. The United States adopted it in 1965. So child welfare issues within the context of human and Indigenous rights haven't really been a very strong presence to at that time. And this was, oh dear, 2014, I believe we went. So this was still like 6 or 7 years ago. But there was a lot of application, right, to child welfare. So when we think about eliminating racial discrimination, and then we, combine that and layer on top of children's rights, we could see there's been a lot of discrimination in the child welfare system against Indigenous peoples, Indigenous families, Indigenous children, that has caused generational harm with respect to the removal, their right to nationality, their right to culture, their right to participation in activities, and a right to proper public health, medical, social security, and social services. At this point, at that point in time in 2014, NICWA had been very actively engaged with the federal government of the United States on implementation of ICWA, and had some conversations saying like, look, ICWA's been in existence for, at that time it was 30 something years. You haven't really done a good job at developing regulations that states can consistently follow. This has caused harm to our communities. It's caused confusion. It's meant that we haven't been able to realize the potential and the dream of ICWA. We got to do something about it. We think regulations is a good way to start. It's something that we can do that will at least help be a bit more consistent, as opposed to states within the United States kind of interpreting however it was they wanted to interpret, leading to a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of confusion, and leaving tribes and legal counsel to just kind of be shaking their heads saying there's a better way. We also heard from tribes who just, their sovereignty was not was not being recognized. They weren't able to exercise their sovereignty, and child welfare cases were getting taken out of their courts, and or their decisions were being upheld. They wanted the full implementation of ICWA as it was supposed to be, and there was very little movement on that. So we developed a shadow report. We made friends ahead of time. We reached out and we found out what other Indigenous organizations were also making shadow reports. I think we also partnered with the U.S. Human Rights Network, and I think there's a couple of other organizations that we knew ahead of time were also writing shadow reports that had components of Indigenous rights, and especially Indigenous children's rights in their shadow reports. NICWA shadow report talked about the non-compliance of this federal law. Lack of federal oversight, lack of education and understanding of ICWA, lack of binding regulations, and inadequate funding for the implementation of ICWA for tribes. And then we went there. We went there in person. We developed a list of questions that we wanted to provide to the committee members so that they could ask those questions of the United States government and their delegation while they were there. And then we took the final report afterwards that, we were successful in getting some of our questions asked, and we used that domestically. We also took the opportunity while we were in Geneva to set up meetings with high-level US officials that we could never get on domestic soil. So, if you imagine, we're in the United Nations building, we're in Geneva, a lot of folks, even though we're kind of staying in different hotels and whatnot, like there were spaces where we were in the same area. And so folks that we never would be able to get meetings with, or even that close of contact, we were actually ending up in the same room together. And so we used that opportunity to advocate, to share information, and really push for those regulations. We also didn't ask for the moon and stars, right? We were very specific about what we wanted. And yes, we could have and should have asked for the moon and stars and everything that we needed to do, but we really focused on just a few things that we thought were actually within the power of the United States government to do. They can provide funding, they can provide regulations, they can provide that oversight. And I can't say that that meeting and that engagement alone was what got us to where we were, but I do strongly believe there was a contributing factor to the development of ICWA regulations for the first time in over 35 years, I think, at that point. So I'm just going to wrap up. I see Jennifer coming on. But the point that I wanted to make is that the international systems and mechanisms can be used in an effective way, but they are not and never will be the be all and end all of advocacy for our peoples. And there's a way that you can utilize those mechanisms effectively that can result in things like what we ended up getting. And I would hope that now we've had a few years at least of those regulations. I hope that we can see those improvements. But that's just one example, I think, of some of those structural interventions that we can make, that if we're not pushing the right buttons, that we find better, bigger buttons to push to really affect the structure and those problematic systems. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. It's really, interesting to hear about, the experience of actually going to the United Nations and some of the things that you might not think about happening as a result of that, those side meetings and the connections. And really, it kind of shows the relationality that we're always working with, right? Those connections that we can make, and how can we use those relationships to have conversations around truth telling, acknowledging, and reconciliation in that way. Something else that struck me in your talk as a structural intervention was when you said that at the gathering in 2005, you didn't feel like you belonged there in the beginning because you weren't, you didn't have letters behind your name at that time. And I think that as a structural intervention, we also need to look at whose knowledge we value, right? And who do we have at the table, simply because they might have expertise in the eyes of the Western system, but who are our true knowledge keepers and who are our true experts. And, that is, as you said, Jocelyn, people with the experience of their own lives and their own paths, and our elders, as well as Dr. Day spoke about in her presentation. So thank you, Jocelyn. Last but not least, I'm very pleased to introduce at a distance Dr. Terry Leibsman and Dr. Paul Gray. Both are with the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Leibsman is with the Faculty of Law, and Dr. Gray is with the Indigenous Child Protection Hub in the Indigenous Education and Research Institute. Dr. Leibsman is a non-Indigenous professor, and Dr. Gray is an Indigenous man, and they're joining us in conversation to talk about structural interventions and their experience in the Australian context. So I believe that Betty will bring up the video, play that for us. And when you get these slides, you will see that they have the email addresses for both Dr. Gray and Dr. Leibsman. And if you have any questions, we would, invite you to reach out to them directly. But we're very fortunate that during this busy time of year, at the end of exams for them, they got together and shared their expertise with us via this video. So take it away, Betty.
Hello, we'd like to thank Melissa and the Touchstones of Hope series for inviting us to be a part of this important seminar series. I'm Terry Leibsman, this is Paul Gray, and we've been invited to speak about structural risk and the relationship between individual and structural risk. Paul will start with an acknowledgement of country, and then we'll have a conversation about the issue of structural risk.
Thanks, Terry. And hi, everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to join this important conversation. As a Wiradjuri man, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we're dialing in from. For me, that is the Tharawal people in just outside of Sydney. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and I want to acknowledge their ongoing custodianship of country. I also want to acknowledge members of the stolen generations and those who are still finding their way home from past forced removals of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families.
And I'd like to add to Paul's acknowledgement, an acknowledgement of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples whose land is on the Sydney East Coast and from where I'm dialing in from today. Thank you. So I guess we'll start off this conversation by reflecting on the quote that was provided as a catalyst for the conversation, and thinking about the time when this quote was actually coined in 2006. 10 years before that, similar recommendations were made by an Australian inquiry, the National Inquiry into the Forced and Unjustified Separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children from their families. So the acknowledgement of the relationship between structural risk and the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or First Peoples children in child welfare systems is not new coin. It's something which has been considered in detail. There have been a range of inquiries and responses since bringing them home, and we might say a little bit more about what bringing them home actually recommended in a few minutes. But despite the repeated reviews and recommendations, we see an ongoing focus rather on the structural and institutional factors which underlie and drive risk, and which have historically created the inequalities which underpin structural risk. We see a focus on individual families and in more recent times, a moralizing of the kind of issues that they face as a result of individual risk. So we'll start off with a few thoughts about bringing them home. Bringing them home, for those who are not aware, was an inquiry that was really advocated for by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so that there'd be a broader, something that was really well known within Aboriginal communities, was the huge impact of forced and unjustified separation of children from families. It wasn't as widely known in the non-First Peoples communities. And so this inquiry came about, and about a third of this inquiry wrote about and focused on contemporary removals and drew the nexus between the historical exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from the resources, from the wealth, from the education, from the health systems that non-Aboriginal peoples had access to, as well as the directly discriminatory trauma of forced separation of families, and not only families, but whole communities who were removed from their lands. And so the National Inquiry in some ways was a watermark in Australia, bringing this to the attention of the broader community. It was also a moment of deep polarisation in Australia. At the time when the inquiry reported, it recommended two foundational sets of recommendations related to structural inequalities and structural reforms, which they found absolutely had to be implemented with respect to contemporary child welfare systems. That contemporary child welfare systems were so failed that they couldn't just be reformed, they had to be completely overhauled. And the two areas of reform that I'm referring to, the structural reforms, are one, the institutional reforms, that child welfare responsibilities had to be transferred to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in accordance with principles of self-determination and in accordance with their own capacity and interest in assuming that responsibility. And the second aspect of the recommendations was a social justice package. And this was to acknowledge the intergenerational poverty and the intergenerational infrastructure deficits that are experienced through colonialism by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And the fact that those structural deficits created through a colonial system are the drivers of overrepresentation in child welfare.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Terry. And I think a particularly interesting element for that is the well-worn reform dialogue and discussion in the 20 plus years since bringing them home. As you noted, there's been numerous reviews, all very much echoing the same sorts of calls that bringing them home made, but all having and the response from government has continued to be quite lackluster and quite resistant to making those sorts of structural changes. I think too, we've seen particularly this shift from the kind of explicit racism of the 60s and 70s, where children were removed on the basis of being members of Aboriginal communities, to using those structural risk factors as those standards. So we see huge rates of substantiations for this amorphous idea of neglect coming in and now being used to provide a kind of more neutral facade for decisions to remove Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And in the absence of actually trying to redress those structural risk factors, communities' experiences of perpetuating those very same systems whilst using different language to kind of distance contemporary child protection systems from their predecessors, as I say, but despite the systems not changing. I think the other part that you touched on that I think is really important is the way that that language continues to focus on positioning the problem in individual parents through the way that kind of trauma is understood and operationalized in these systems, in families more broadly, and in communities. And the way that that then takes the focus off the very systems that create these challenges in the first place, and the sorts of solutions then that are presented are about being better and more effective in the responses to families, that is kind of entrenching and enhancing current systems rather than engaging in these very important structural reforms that have been called for years.
Dichotomy between the claims of equality, the claims of the rule of law, and the practice and experience of structures which continue inequality and discrimination to equality is something which really Bringing Them Home attempted to address in its self-determination recommendation. Because if child welfare laws and practices are to be meaningful for Aboriginal communities, then the institutions have to incorporate and have to acknowledge and recognise the values which are meaningful and create safety and uplift the inclusion and sense of belongingness and sense of significance of child welfare practice within communities. And the way to do that, which has been recognised for so long and which has been called for by communities for so long, is to actually reform those institutions, reform those structures, and to make them structures which accord with Aboriginal customs, laws, and values, so that people actually don't see them as an imposition, see them as something that's to be feared, see them as something that's external and irrelevant, but see them as something that they actually value, that they actually support, and that actually makes their communities something better and stronger and more relevant.
Yeah, and I think that that principle of self-determination is a really interesting one, particularly in the way that since Bringing Them Home, the reform dialogue in this space has in many ways actively sought to diminish its meaning and diminish its scope, so that it, in a way, to take it away from those key principles that you've just outlined and the key benefits of grounding a system in self-determination, about aligning it with community values and perspectives, about aligning it with community governance and allowing, empowering First Nations communities to determine their own futures and support families and their children in the way that is best suited to them, and have really kind of narrowed it in important ways to be more about the participation of families within broader settler systems. And so the scope of family decision-making is always constrained by these broader settler systems, but the language of self-determination is invoked in that term. And I think one of the really interesting lenses that I've been thinking through recently is this idea of legitimacy in the use of state power. which I think lines up with those principles that you've just mentioned, Terry, about for the use of state power to be seen as legitimate, it has to be applied according to clearly defined rules, and those rules have to line up with the community's perspective of how those systems should operate, and that it needs to operate with the consent of those communities who are affected. And obviously, this is not the case for First Nations communities, particularly in the child welfare space. And I think the interesting part of that dialogue is the kind of disconnect between efforts to address the problem of legitimacy and efforts to address this, what is sometimes seen as a separate problem of effectiveness of these systems. Whereas when we actually look at the literature about legitimacy and effectiveness, we see that effectiveness is actually part of legitimacy. So if we don't do legitimacy, if we don't ground our reforms in about addressing the problem of legitimacy, and the fact that these systems are not legitimate and are not seen as not legitimate, then our efforts to address the effectiveness gap will always be limited. And it means that the outcomes achieved for our children and our families will always be suboptimal and below what they should be.
I guess the paradox is that legitimacy and that accountability really connects to relationships between communities that have fidelity and that have trust. And the whole colonial relationship, especially in child welfare, is founded in a lack of fidelity and a lack of trust and a lack of accountability. So the incorporation and meaningful recognition of self-determination in child welfare, in fact, serves both First Nations and colonial systems in terms of bringing values that they hold in common of accountability, fidelity, and trust to the relationships between each other, but very importantly, for the relationships internally for families in terms of their child welfare services.
Terry, I think one of the interesting extensions of sort of this discussion is the way that governments have increasingly turned to inviting Aboriginal communities into service delivery as a way of bridging, I suppose, or at least being seen to bridge those gaps. What's your reflection on, because I appreciate that this has happened alongside a broader kind of push within jurisdictions to, I suppose for want of a better word, outsource key services to families by bringing in non-government and other providers to fulfill those roles. And this is seen as kind of by inviting in Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to deliver those services as being delivering on that that long-running issue about entrenching self-determination. What are your reflections on that?
Absolutely, and I think this is a really promising but also very dangerous kind of policy shift, because as you say, there's this increasing in a range of jurisdictions. In some places it has happened already, transfer of child welfare responsibilities to Aboriginal organisations. And this raises the question of on what terms and what underpins this transfer. Is it in terms of actually transferring the political responsibility and distributing the political responsibility which comes together with the resources that are necessary to take on that responsibility and to assume public kind of power? Or is this a transfer of, and in the broader kind of framework of privatisation, is this part of a process to try and divest governments of responsibility for high demand, high cost sections of the community, and to really avoid that kind of responsibility in the name of another principle. And, you know, in the Australian context, a particular example comes to mind. In New South Wales, where both Paul and I live, where we are zooming in from, in 2018, Minister Prue Goward, our child welfare minister at the time, passed legislation which involved a range of things, including permanency planning, to in fact ensure that children were permanently placed within a short time frame, within 2 years. And the justification for this, as many people listening would be familiar, to stop children from being bounced around in multiple placements. But it also is a way of privatizing responsibility for children in out-of-home care, because it's a way of divesting the responsibility to a permanent placement, which the government no longer has to attend to. And with the transfer of responsibility to Aboriginal children's organisations, they'd inherit that responsibility and the kinds of, drivers and measures of their success as service providers will be included in contracts, including that sort of measure. Prue Goward resigned after that. That's her legacy. And she went on to the University of Western. And in fact, recently, as a professor at Western, the former Community Services Minister wrote an op-ed in the Australian Financial Review. And it was to warn us not to underestimate the underclass. And her op-ed really encapsulated for me some of the dangers of the intersection between and the different values which underpin privatisation and self-determination. Because in this op-ed, directly, people who are in poverty, people who come into contact with child welfare systems, and First Peoples children are in a disproportionate number who do, are blamed as being morally responsible for that, as being lazy, and as being a group of people that governments worry about and don't want that big budget included in. And I think together with the privatisation of services, not just child welfare, not just to Aboriginal organisations, we have a competing set of values, a set of values which is really about individualising responsibility. It's about, again, focusing on families as the source of the problem. And it's about hyper-privatising, when self-determination is really about sharing sovereignty. It's about sharing public and political power. And so I think it's something that we really need to unpack and think about when transferring or delegating responsibility. Is it going to be changing the institutions? Is it going to make that structural change? But also, is it going to be accompanied by the resources that are necessary to address the intergenerational inequalities that exist that underpin child welfare? And so these are issues which create a lot of tension, because clearly it's a good thing for assumption by Aboriginal organisations of responsibility for one's own children, but are the terms right? And is there a genuine equality and addressing of structural inequalities which underpin overrepresentation, in fact, being encompassed in this delegation?
Yeah, and look, Terry, I think you and I could have a discussion about these issues for a very long time. But I think to kind of close off, one of the key points and reflections on that quote about the need to address those structural risks if there is to be any chance to reduce is that is ultimately that conversation between entrenching the current systems and sort of strengthening those current systems, but also trying to obscure and distance the responsibilities for their outcomes, which I think is the kinds of reforms that we tend to see here, in my experience, against really acknowledging that it is often the systems themselves that are failing families. It's not the families that are failing in that sense. It's that our broader public systems are failing to provide the sorts of conditions and resources that families need to support their kids to thrive. And it's those systems that we need to significantly transform, not make little tweaks around the edges, but completely transform them if we want to see different outcomes. And by different outcomes, we mean better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're looking at whether it's equality, when we're looking at structural reforms, are we looking at whether we are going to attain equality of outcomes, equality of opportunity, which would require incredibly radical reform, or is it just equality to participate on some terms in the system?
Wow, I really enjoyed that. And it's very interesting to see the parallels in all of our different contexts, Canada, the United States, Australia, and the way that our settler governments are using similar strategies in terms of offloading responsibilities without adequate resources, taking up the language of self-determination and rights, while continuing to make very small incremental changes and not actually following through with the sort of radical movements that we need, and that, like, as we said earlier, that we actually know how to do. So I could also talk on and on about this for quite a long time, but in the interest of having a bit of a dialogue before we close, I would like to invite questions from the group, either through the chat box or by taking yourself off mute and asking a question directly. Oh, I see Jocelyn's point here. Another way international mechanisms can be effective, international solidarity. And yes, certainly it is very, in a strange way, it's affirming to hear that other people or other Indigenous people in colonial contexts are going through the same thing, and also coming to the same conclusion based on their ancestral knowledges. And that is a beautiful thing to see those relationships. No questions. Well, then I would like to invite any closing remarks from our speakers, if there are any. I don't want my word to be the last word of the day. I think we should have a closing remark from our wonderful panelists.
I'll just say thank you to NICWA and to the Caring Society for hosting the sessions. Thank you for having me as your MC for most of the sessions. Thank you to Jennifer for filling in for this last one. The work is ongoing, and some days are better than others. And I just think that this kind of a dialogue series and the resource, just putting it out there into the world so that others can pick it up and carry on in the work that they're doing for empowerment, encouragement, inspiration, I think is really powerful. And I hope that if you continue to have these dialogues, that I'll continue to be invited to be a part in some way. So I just want to express my appreciation to the organizations, and it was really great to be on a panel with Dr. Day, and it's great to hear from the folks from Australia. And even though it's the middle of the night, so I understand why they're not here, but maybe someday we can be in the same room.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you to those who joined and for hosting these conversations, and let's go out and start a revolution.
Mhm. I think we know what to do. It's just a matter of carrying on and getting it done. And I think we're going to get there. I think we have to get there, right? For our kids and for the elders and everyone who's already done so much work along the way. So let's leave it there on the note of revolution. So thank you, everyone. Good day. You will receive an email from us with all of the links, with the information, and you do also have our contact information if you would like to reach out. So wishing you all a wonderful day. Take care.